still remember the exact second I realized that the mountains were not empty, because the silence around our rescue camp that night was not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like something is holding its breath while it waits for you to make a mistake. My name does not matter anymore, because what we found in those peaks in 1913 followed us long after our names were erased from the reports. And I am telling you this now because most of the men who were there never made it back, and the few of us who did were told to stay quiet for the rest of our lives. You are about to hear a story that was locked inside military archives, handwritten journals, and the memories of men who spent their final years terrified of the dark. And if you listen closely, you will understand why no one who saw it ever wanted to be alone again. If you are the kind of person who wants the truth instead of fairy tales, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now, because every story we release is pulled from real testimony, forbidden records, and things that were never meant to be found by the public. And I am asking you to comment the word witness below this video, because the more people who acknowledge this story, the harder it becomes for it to be buried again. Now listen carefully, because what I am about to tell you is not a legend, and it is not a myth, and it is not something you can forget once you hear it. I was part of a mountain rescue unit stationed deep in the northern wilderness in the winter of 1913, and the night we were sent to recover a group of missing climbers was the night we learned that something old and starving was watching us from the trees. We did not know its name yet, but before that mission was over, every man who survived was whispering the same word in terror: Wechuge. The storm had already been screaming through the mountain passes for hours when our commander finally gave the order to move, and even though none of us said it out loud, every man standing in that snow-covered rescue camp could feel that this mission was different from the others, because the air itself carried a pressure that felt less like weather and more like something waiting to be disturbed. We were 6 men in total, trained climbers and medics, hardened by years of pulling broken bodies out of avalanches and ravines. Yet as we strapped on our packs and checked our lanterns, I saw something in their eyes that I had never seen before, which was not fear of death, but fear of what might still be alive out there in the dark. The report that had brought us out into the mountains was simple enough on paper, because a group of 3 prospectors had failed to return from a high-altitude pass after sending a final message about finding something strange in a cave. Yet the last words they transmitted had been so erratic and panicked that even the telegraph operator in the valley had refused to repeat them more than once. As we began our ascent through the narrow pine-lined trail, the wind clawed at our coats and drove needles of ice into our faces, while the forest around us groaned and shifted as if it were reacting to our presence. And with every step I felt the growing certainty that whatever those men had found was not something that wanted to be seen. We found the first sign of them just after nightfall, when one of our lanterns revealed a torn piece of wool fabric caught on a low branch, and the edges of the cloth were dark with something that no longer looked like blood, but something older and thicker, as though it had been exposed to the cold long enough to become part of the mountain itself. No one spoke when we saw it, because silence felt safer than asking the questions that were already forming in our minds. So we pressed on, following a trail of broken branches and deep footprints that did not match any animal we knew, because they were too long and too narrow, and spaced too far apart for a man to have made them. By the time we reached the cave entrance, the wind had dropped suddenly, and the world felt wrong in a way that made the hair on my arms rise beneath my sleeves, because the forest had gone completely still, as though even the birds and animals were afraid to make a sound. The cave itself was a black wound in the side of the mountain, breathing out a slow, cold air that smelled faintly of rot and something metallic, and when we shone our lanterns inside, the light barely seemed to touch the walls before being swallowed by the darkness within. Inside, we found the first body. One of the prospectors lay just inside the entrance, frozen in a position that suggested he had been trying to crawl back out, with his mouth open in a silent scream and his eyes wide and glassy, as though he had died staring at something that had terrified him beyond comprehension. His hands were shredded, not cut cleanly but torn, as if he had tried to grip something rough and powerful that had pulled him backward into the cave, and the marks on his arms looked less like claws and more like the impression of something that had too many joints and too much strength. When I bent down to examine him, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten because his skin had been gnawed away in places, and the pattern of the wound suggested not an animal feeding but something that had been tasting him. We had barely taken this in when a sound echoed from deeper inside the cave, and it was not the sound of wind or falling rock, but something wet and deliberate, as though a large body was shifting its weight in the darkness while it waited. That was the moment I understood that whatever had killed this man was still close enough to hear us breathing. We should have turned back the moment we heard that sound from the depths of the cave, because every instinct I had as a man and as a rescuer was telling me that this was no longer a recovery mission but an encounter with something that did not belong in the natural world. Yet the commander gave a single sharp gesture forward, and none of us were brave enough or foolish enough to disobey him. As we moved deeper into the cave, the light from our lanterns revealed walls covered in strange markings that did not resemble any language or symbols I had ever seen, because they looked more like long scratches that had been carved by something with too much patience and too much time, as though the cave itself had been slowly claimed by whatever lived inside it. The air grew thicker with every step, carrying a stench that made my throat tighten and my eyes water, because it was a mix of decay and something like old smoke, as if this place had once been touched by fire and had never truly recovered. We found the second prospector further in, wedged between two stone outcroppings, and even though he was dead, his body was still warm enough to release steam into the cold air, which meant that whatever had taken him had done so only minutes before we arrived. His chest was hollowed out, not torn apart in a frenzy, but opened with a kind of deliberate force that suggested intelligence rather than hunger. And inside the cavity there was nothing left but ragged bone and frozen blood, as though something had removed his organs with care instead of violence. One of the men whispered a prayer under his breath, and the sound of his voice seemed to ripple through the cave in a way that made the shadows shift, which was when we all realized that the darkness around us was not empty but layered, like something vast was moving just beyond the reach of our light. Then we heard it. A slow, scraping step somewhere above us, followed by the sound of heavy breathing that did not come from any human lungs, because it was too deep and too uneven, as though the creature making it had to remember how to draw air. I looked up just in time to see something retreating into a crack in the cave ceiling, and even though I only saw a glimpse of it, the image burned itself into my mind, because it was tall and thin and bent in a way that no human body should ever bend, with limbs that seemed to fold back on themselves like broken branches. The commander raised his rifle, but before he could fire, a piece of rock fell from above and struck one of our men in the shoulder, knocking him to the ground with a cry of pain that echoed through the cave like a signal. That was when the thing moved. It dropped from the ceiling with a sound like wet leather tearing, and it landed between us and the cave entrance with a force that sent a shock through the stone beneath our boots, and for a fraction of a second our lanterns illuminated its shape. What stood before us was not an animal and not a man, but something that looked like a starving corpse stretched into a towering, unnatural form, with skin pulled tight over jagged bones and a face that was twisted into a permanent expression of hunger and rage. Its eyes were not glowing, but they were black and reflective, and they fixed on us with an intelligence that felt ancient and cruel, as though it knew exactly who we were and how little chance we had of surviving. When it opened its mouth, the smell that poured out was so foul that I nearly gagged, and the sound it made was not a roar but a low, rasping whisper that somehow formed a word I would never forget. Wechuge! And the moment it spoke its own name, I knew that we were standing in the presence of something that had been hunting humans long before our rescue unit had ever existed. The moment the Wechuge spoke, the cave itself seemed to recoil, because the sound of its voice was not carried by air, but by something deeper, something that vibrated through the stone and into our bones, making it feel as though the mountain was no longer a place of shelter, but a living thing that had just turned against us. None of us fired right away, not because we lacked the will, but because there was something about the way that creature stood there, tall and unnaturally still, that made it feel less like prey and more like a judge, as though it was measuring us, deciding which of us it would take first. Its body was stretched and distorted, with arms that hung too long at its sides and joints that bent at angles that made my eyes hurt to look at. And yet there was a terrible elegance in the way it held itself, as though every movement was calculated and controlled by a mind that was far older than any human. When it finally moved, it did not charge, but took a single slow step toward us, and the sound of its foot pressing into the cave floor was heavy and wet, as though the stone itself was being bruised by its weight. One of the men behind me lost his nerve and fired a shot, and the explosion of the rifle echoed through the cave in a way that made my ears ring. Yet when the bullet struck the Wechuge, it did not stagger or cry out, but simply turned its head to look at the man who had dared to hurt it. I will never forget that look, because it was not anger that filled its dark eyes, but something closer to disappointment, as though it had expected more from us. In the next instant, it moved with a speed that was impossible for something so tall and thin, crossing the distance between us in a blur of pale limbs, and tearing into the man who had fired with a single violent motion that lifted him off the ground. His scream was cut short as the Wechuge dragged him backward, and the sound of his body striking the cave wall was followed by a wet crunch that made my stomach turn, because I knew that no one could survive a force like that. The rest of us opened fire then, filling the cave with flashes of light and deafening cracks of gunfire, yet the creature seemed to slip between the bullets, moving in a way that felt less like running and more like flowing through space itself. When one of the shots finally struck its shoulder, it let out a sound that was half snarl and half laughter, and I realized with a cold certainty that it was not afraid of us, because fear was something it had long since consumed. The commander shouted for us to fall back, and we began to retreat toward the cave entrance, dragging our wounded with us as the Wechuge advanced at a steady, unhurried pace, as though it knew that the mountain itself would prevent our escape. Just as we reached the mouth of the cave, a sudden tremor shook the ground, and chunks of rock fell from above, blocking the opening behind us, because the creature had somehow caused a collapse that sealed us inside with it. In the dim, dust-filled light of our lanterns, we stood there trapped with something that had been feeding on men for longer than our country had existed, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest like a living thing. That was when I understood that survival would not depend on strength or weapons, but on whether we could outthink a monster that had been doing this for centuries. With the cave entrance sealed behind us and the Wechuge standing between us and any hope of escape, the world narrowed to the flickering circles of light cast by our lanterns, and every shadow seemed to stretch and twist as though it were trying to hide the creature's movements from us. The commander tried to organize us, shouting orders that sounded thin and fragile in the vastness of the cave, because no amount of training could prepare a man for facing something that did not obey the rules of life or death. We moved as one, keeping our weapons trained on the Wechuge as we edged along the cavern wall, searching desperately for another way out, while the creature followed us with a patient curiosity that made it feel less like a predator and more like a collector examining its next prize. As we passed deeper into the cave, I noticed strange shapes embedded in the stone, and when I shone my lantern on them, my blood ran cold, because they were not rocks at all, but the frozen remains of human bodies, trapped in the walls as though the mountain itself had swallowed them whole. Their faces were twisted into expressions of terror and agony, and some of them looked so old that their clothing had turned to dust, which meant that the Wechuge had been feeding here for generations, slowly building a graveyard inside its own lair. One of the men began to sob quietly, and I could not blame him, because the realization that we were walking through the remains of its past victims made it feel as though we were already dead, just waiting our turn to be added to the walls. The Wechuge let out a low, rasping sound that almost sounded like amusement, and it began to circle us, forcing us to turn and turn again, until the dizziness and fear made it hard to keep our footing on the uneven stone. Suddenly it lunged, not at the men with guns, but at our wounded, and before we could react, it had seized one of them and lifted him into the air with a single hand, his legs kicking uselessly as he screamed for us to help him. The creature leaned close to his face, and even from where I stood, I could see its mouth moving, as though it were whispering something to him. And the man's eyes went wide with a terror that seemed deeper than the fear of death, as though the Wechuge was showing him something no human was meant to see. Then, with a casual flick of its arm, it threw him against the cave wall, and the impact was so violent that his body burst apart in a spray of blood and bone that painted the stone red. That was when something inside me broke, and I realized that if we stayed in that cave, we would all die one by one, not as soldiers or rescuers, but as food. I noticed a narrow tunnel behind the creature, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, and I shouted for the others to follow me, because even a small chance of escape was better than waiting for our turn to be taken. As we ran for it, the Wechuge let out a sound that was not anger but delight, and it came after us, its long limbs slamming into the stone as it closed the distance with terrifying ease. We threw ourselves into the tunnel just as it reached us, and I felt its claws rake across my back, tearing through my coat and into my flesh, but the pain was nothing compared to the fear of knowing that it was right behind us, crawling into the darkness with us like a living nightmare. And in that suffocating tunnel, with the sound of its breathing filling the space around us, I knew that even if we escaped the cave, the Wechuge would never truly let us go. The tunnel narrowed so abruptly that my shoulders scraped the stone on both sides, and every breath tasted like dust and cold mineral rot, while the lantern light jittered across the walls in frantic pulses because my hand would not stop shaking, and behind us the sound of the Wechuge crawling was not the frantic scrambling of an animal, but the slow, deliberate drag of something that knew the tunnel was too small for us to fight back in. We moved in a panicked line, one man after another, boots sliding on wet stone, knees bruising with every shove forward, and I could hear the commander ahead of me barking short instructions that were swallowed by the tunnel, because sound did not travel properly in that tight throat of rock. It only bounced and returned to us like a warning. When the first man in line tried to lift his lantern higher to see the bend ahead, his flames sputtered as if the air itself rejected warmth, and the darkness rushed in so fast that for a second I could not see the outline of the men in front of me, only the faint glint of metal buckles and the white fog of their breath, which made me understand that we were being guided deeper, not escaping, because the mountain was taking away our last tool for direction. Then the Wechuge whispered again, and this time the sound came from inside the tunnel itself, as though its voice did not need space to move through, as though it could be placed directly into our heads, and the words were not loud but intimate, like a confession spoken into your ear. And even though I could not make out every syllable, I understood the intention, because the message was simple. It knew our names. I heard it shape the commander's surname first, then one of the medics, then mine, and each time it said a name the man who carried it stiffened as if a hook had been set into his spine, because there is a special kind of terror that comes when something that should not know you speaks to you like an old acquaintance. The man behind me began to sob, not loudly, but in those strangled little sounds that happen when a throat is trying to keep panic contained, and I wanted to turn and grab him and tell him to stop, because I knew we were prey in a confined space and any weakness would be exploited. But before I could reach him, the tunnel shook with a heavy impact, and dust rained down, and I felt a pressure behind us like a body filling the passage. The Wechuge had caught up. The next sound was the wet pop of something being pulled too hard, and then the sobbing man's breath vanished, replaced by a muffled gurgle that told me his face was pressed into stone or flesh, and I knew without seeing it that the creature had him by the ankle and was dragging him backward into the darkness, not to kill him quickly, but to take him somewhere it could enjoy the process. The commander screamed for us to keep moving, and we did, because in that moment loyalty was a luxury and survival was all that mattered, and I hated myself for how fast my body obeyed, for how easily I left a man behind simply because the tunnel demanded forward motion. We reached a wider pocket where the ceiling rose just enough for us to crouch, and when we tumbled into that space the lantern flame steadied slightly, revealing a chamber shaped like a throat opening into lungs, with old bones scattered across the ground in neat piles, and strips of cloth and broken gear wedged into cracks like trophies, and my stomach turned when I recognized the rusted insignia on a belt buckle that belonged to a rescue unit from decades earlier, which meant the creature had taken rescuers before us and kept parts of them like souvenirs. In the back of the chamber there was a vertical crack leading upward, and cold air flowed down from it with the clean bite of open night, and we all saw it at once, and the hope that surged through us was almost painful, because for a second it felt like the world might let us go. We began to climb, hands and boots searching for holds, rifles slung awkwardly, bodies scraping and twisting in the narrow chimney, and I went second to last, with the commander above me and another man below me. and as I climbed I felt warmth on the back of my neck that did not belong in the mountain. The Wechuge had entered the chamber. It did not rush us. It waited, and it watched, and then it made a sound that was not a snarl, but a soft inhale, as if it were smelling our fear like perfume, and the man below me began to shake so violently that his boots slipped, and he fell, and when he hit the ground his ankle broke with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. The Wechuge moved then, and the lantern light caught its limbs unfolding, and the last thing I saw before I forced myself higher was the creature reaching down with one long hand, not grabbing the fallen man by his coat or his arms, but by his face, as if it wanted to hold him gently while it decided how to begin. We climbed until our muscles screamed and our fingers went numb, and the crack in the rock scraped skin from our knuckles and tore buttons from our coats, but none of us stopped, because behind us the chamber was filled with a sound that I will never be able to forget, which was not the quick violence of a killing but the slow, wet rhythm of something feeding while it kept its victim alive, long enough to make the meal feel earned. At last the crack widened into a shelf of stone dusted with fresh snow, and we spilled out into the open night like men being born again, heaving for breath, eyes watering from wind and cold. And for one fragile moment the sky above us looked enormous and indifferent, and the stars felt like proof that the world still existed beyond that cave. We were high on the mountain now, above the tree line, surrounded by jagged ridges and white slopes, and the storm had shifted into a strange calm that made the air feel too clear, too sharp, as if the weather was holding back out of respect for something older than it. The commander counted us quickly, and when he realized how many were missing his face hardened into a mask, but I could see the tremor in his jaw, because even he understood that we were not simply losing men. We were being harvested, and the mountain was helping. He ordered us to move toward the ridge line where we could signal the valley. Yet as we started across the slope I noticed something that made my blood slow, because the snow around us was marked with the same narrow, long footprints we had followed earlier. And they did not lead toward the cave. They led ahead of us, scattered like a trail set hours ago. It had been outside. It had known the exit. It had allowed us to climb. The realization hit me like a physical blow, because it meant the tunnel and chamber were not a desperate escape route we had discovered, but a path it had used before. And the bones in that chamber were not random remains. They were evidence of a routine, like a butcher's station placed between trap and table. One of the men, the medic with frost on his mustache, began to talk to himself as we walked, repeating simple facts as if trying to anchor his mind, saying our unit number, the date, the mission objective, the names of towns in the valley. But his voice kept breaking because beneath his words was the understanding that facts do not protect you from a thing that does not care about your reality. We reached a narrow saddle between two rock faces, and the wind tunneled through it with a low howl, and the sound made me think of the cave again, and that thought alone was enough to make me turn my head and look back. I saw it. It stood far behind us on the slope, so still that at first I thought it was a dead tree or a shadow cast by rock. But then the moonlight caught the angle of its limbs, and the shape resolved into something upright and patient, and I felt my stomach drop, because it was not chasing. It was escorting. As we pushed through the saddle, the commander tried to keep us tight, rifles out, eyes sweeping, yet the terrain forced us into single file again. And I could feel the same claustrophobia returning even under open sky, because stone walls can be just as trapping as cave walls when something bigger than you is moving silently nearby. Then the medic stumbled, and when he looked down he froze, because beneath a thin crust of snow there was cloth, and beneath the cloth there was a human hand, blackened by cold, half buried like the mountain had tried to hide it. We dug, not because it was smart, but because we needed answers, and within minutes we uncovered the third prospector, or what was left of him, laid out as if arranged, limbs positioned with unnatural care, and carved into the snow beside him were the same scratches we had seen inside the cave, repeated in a spiral pattern that drew your eyes inward like a trap. The commander muttered that it was a warning, but I knew it was more than that, because the arrangement felt ritualistic, like a message written in bodies, and the longer I stared at the spiral, the more I felt a pressure behind my eyes, as if something wanted me to understand. And then, just as I tore my gaze away, the wind died again and the saddle went silent. and I realized the silence was not weather, it was attention. From somewhere above us on the rock ledge that overlooked the pass, a shadow moved and a pale shape unfolded from it, and the Wechuge stepped into view with the calm confidence of something that had cut off every path except the one it wanted us to take. It looked down at us like a man studying animals in a pen, and when it opened its mouth, its breath drifted down in the cold air like smoke, and it spoke softly, as if it did not need to shout to be obeyed. Ko. And my body, traitorous and trembling, understood that word the way prey understands a handler's whistle, because in that instant I knew we were not trying to get off the mountain. We were being guided deeper into it. The moment the Wechuge told us to come, something inside my chest collapsed, because there was no anger in its voice and no urgency, only the quiet certainty of a thing that had already decided our fate and was merely inviting us to walk toward it on our own legs. The commander raised his rifle and fired, not because he believed it would work, but because men are not built to stand still when death is speaking to them. And the crack of the shot rolled across the mountains like thunder, yet the bullet passed through a space where the creature's head had been a moment before, because it moved just enough to let it miss, as though it wanted to show us that even our best timing meant nothing to it. Then it stepped down from the ledge. It did not jump or scramble, but descended the rock face in a series of slow, impossible movements, limbs bending and unfolding as if gravity were a suggestion rather than a law. And every place it touched the stone seemed to darken, as though something of it remained behind. We backed away without speaking, boots slipping on loose snow, rifles shaking in our hands, while the medic began to pray out loud, because when the mind can no longer find reason, it reaches for whatever might still listen. The Wechuge tilted its head, and I realized with a sickening clarity that it was listening, not to the prayer, but to the man's fear, as though it could hear the way his heart was trying to escape his ribs. Without warning, it surged forward, crossing the distance between us in a blur of pale motion, and before any of us could fire, it had seized the medic by the chest and lifted him into the air as easily as a child lifting a doll. His prayer turned into a scream, and the sound echoed across the stone walls of the saddle, but the creature did not bite or tear him apart. Instead, it brought its face close to his, and I saw its mouth move slowly, shaping words that only he could hear. The medic's eyes changed then, and the terror in them was replaced by something worse, which was understanding, because whatever the Wechuge was showing him was not a threat but a truth. Then it dropped him. The fall should have killed him, but it did not, and he lay there gasping and broken, staring at the sky as if it were something unfamiliar. And when I ran to him despite the commander's shout, he grabbed my sleeve with surprising strength and whispered a single sentence that still haunts me. "It knows where we are going." Before I could ask what he meant, the Wechuge moved again, and this time it did not take him, but stepped over his body as though he were already dead, and continued toward us with a patience that felt worse than any rage. We ran, not in a coordinated retreat, but in a desperate scattering, because when a predator closes in, you do not think of formation or orders, you think only of distance. And the mountains around us became a maze of white slopes and black stone as we tried to put space between us and the thing that did not tire. I followed the commander along a narrow ridge, the drop on either side vanishing into darkness, and every step felt like a gamble between falling to my death or slowing just enough for the Wechuge to catch up. Behind us I could hear it, not running but moving with that same smooth inevitability, and sometimes I thought I heard more than one set of steps, as though the mountain itself were echoing its presence. We reached a narrow crevice that cut down through the ridge like a wound, and the commander slid into it, signaling for me to follow, because even a small space might buy us time. But as I dropped in, I felt a vibration through the rock, and I knew the Wechuge had chosen this path for us, because it always chose the path. The crevice was steep and choked with ice, and as we slid down into it, the walls closed in so tightly that the sky above shrank to a thin strip of stars, and the cold pressed against us with a weight that made every breath feel like it was being stolen before it reached our lungs. We tumbled into a lower basin where snow had drifted high against jagged stone, and the commander motioned for silence, because even though we were separated from the Wechuge by nothing more than a twisting shaft of rock, the sound of our breathing felt loud enough to guide it straight to us. The medic was not with us anymore. Neither were the other two men. It was only the commander and me now, standing in a frozen pocket of the mountain that felt less like a place and more like a waiting room for something that had not yet decided how to finish with us. We could hear the Wechuge above us, not climbing down yet, but moving back and forth near the mouth of the crevice, scraping stone with slow, thoughtful motions, as though it were considering which of us it wanted to take first, or whether it wanted to take us at all. The commander whispered that it was hurting us, because predators that play do not always want to kill quickly. They want to learn how their prey breaks. And I knew he was right, because the fear I felt was no longer just of death, but of being known. I found something half buried in the snow, and when I brushed it free, I saw that it was an old leather journal, stiff with age and damp from the cold. And when I opened it, my hands began to shake, because the pages were filled with the handwriting of a rescue unit that had been here decades before us. They wrote about a thing in the mountains that took men and left their bones in patterns, and about hearing voices in the dark that sounded like loved ones calling, and about realizing too late that the creature was not just hunting bodies, but collecting memories and using them like bait. The last entry was a single line, written so hard the pen had torn the paper. It knows you before it takes you. A sudden shadow fell across the snow, and I looked up to see the Wechuge peering down into the basin from the mouth of the crevice, its head tilted in that curious way, its long limbs braced against the stone like a spider on the edge of a well. It smiled, not with lips, but with the slow stretching of skin over teeth, and in that moment I knew it had read the journal too, in its own way, because it had been there when those words were written, watching, waiting, and letting them think they were alone. The commander raised his rifle for the last time, and I could see in his eyes that he had made a decision, because sometimes the only way to save someone is to give a monster what it wants. He told me to run when he fired, and when the shot rang out and the Wechuge turned toward him with sudden interest, I did not hesitate, because I understood that survival was not about courage anymore. It was about being the one who was not chosen. I ran across the snow, climbing toward a distant ridge that promised nothing but space, and behind me I heard the Wechuge move, not after me, but toward the commander, because sacrifice had a smell that it could not resist. The last thing I heard before the wind swallowed everything was the sound of something being taken, in a voice that almost sounded grateful. I do not remember how long I ran, because when fear takes control, the body stops measuring time and begins measuring only distance. And every step across the frozen ridge felt like a bargain I was making with the mountain, because it could have dropped me into the dark at any moment, but chose not to, as though it wanted me alive for something yet to come. The wind cut through my torn coat and burned my lungs with every breath, yet I did not slow down, because behind me I could feel the absence of the Wechuge more strongly than its presence, and that absence was worse, because it meant the creature was no longer reacting to me. It was thinking. I reached a cluster of jagged rocks that rose from the snow like broken teeth, and I pressed myself against them, forcing my breathing to quiet, because sound felt like a beacon in that open wilderness. And as I waited, I tried to convince myself that the thing had chosen the commander and would be satisfied. But deep down I knew that a creature that had fed for centuries did not stop because of a single meal. That was when I heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing, but my name, spoken softly, gently, in the voice of my mother, who had been dead for 10 years by then, and the sound of it made my vision blur, because there are some parts of a person that remain open no matter how hard you try to protect them. The Wechuge was not behind me. It was nowhere I could see, and yet it was closer than it had ever been, because it had stepped into my memory. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voice continued, calling me the way she used to when I was a child lost in a crowd, and every instinct in my body told me to turn toward it, because love is a stronger lure than fear. I bit down on my glove until I tasted blood, just to anchor myself to something real, and I whispered the commander's name over and over, because if I kept thinking about the man who had died for me, I might not listen to the thing that wanted me to follow. The snow around me began to shift, not with movement, but with intention, because shadows lengthened and folded inward, creating shapes that suggested paths and figures and doorways where none existed before. And I realized that the Wechuge was not chasing me through space anymore. It was chasing me through choice. Every direction felt wrong. Every silence felt like a trap. I stumbled away from the rocks and down into a shallow valley, and when I looked back, I saw it at last, standing on the ridge I had crossed, its tall form outlined against the night sky, not moving, not reaching for me, but watching, and in its stillness, there was a promise. It did not need to hurry. It knew that sooner or later, exhaustion or grief or memory would turn me around. I screamed at it, not words but a raw sound pulled from somewhere beneath language, and the creature tilted its head, as though considering the noise, and then it did something I did not expect. It nodded. Not in mockery, but in acknowledgement, as if to say that it understood exactly what I was feeling, because it had felt it in 1,000 men before me. And that was when I knew that the Wechuge was not a beast but a collector of human breaking points, and that it fed not just on flesh but on the moment when hope gives way. I ran again, not because I believed I could escape, but because as long as I was moving, I was still choosing, and choice was the only thing it could not take from me. By the time the first light of dawn bled into the sky, I was no longer running toward anything. I was running away from myself, because the memories the Wechuge had touched were still echoing in my mind, and every thought felt like it might open a door I could never close again. The mountains looked different in daylight, sharp and beautiful and indifferent, and that made everything feel worse, because it meant that the horror of the night was not a dream. It was something that had happened under the same sky that now looked so calm. I reached the edge of the high pass just as the sun crested the horizon, and below me the valley spread out like a map, with smoke rising from the small settlement where our base camp had been, and the sight of it made my knees give out, because for the first time in hours I could see something human. I slid down the slope, half falling, half crawling, until my boots hit packed snow and then bare ground, and when the first sentry saw me, he shouted, because I must have looked like a ghost, covered in blood and ice, eyes wild with something I could not explain. They took me inside, wrapped me in blankets, poured hot liquid down my throat, and asked me where the others were. And I tried to answer, but every time I opened my mouth I saw the Wechuge's eyes in my mind, and the words died before they could escape. I told them there had been an avalanche. I told them we lost the trail. I told them nothing that mattered. They wrote it down anyway. In the days that followed, search parties went into the mountains and came back empty, because the Wechuge does not leave what it takes where anyone else can find it. And soon the official story became that we were the victims of weather and bad luck, because that is easier to accept than a hunger that wears a face. But at night, when I tried to sleep, I heard it again, not calling my name this time, but breathing, slow and patient, just beyond the walls of whatever room I was in. And I knew that it was not done with me, because it had not taken the thing it wanted most. It had not taken my choice, and that meant it would keep waiting, because a creature that lives on human will knows that sooner or later, everyone gets tired of running. The years after the mountain passed like a slow fever, because even though my body returned to the valley, my mind never truly followed. And everywhere I went, I carried the sense that something was walking just a few steps behind me, not close enough to be seen, but close enough to be felt. They discharged me from the rescue unit with a commendation and a quiet warning, because men who come back alone from places where others vanish are inconvenient, and the reports they file have a way of making people uncomfortable. So they paid me, thanked me, and told me to forget. I tried. I took work in other towns. I slept in rooms with locked doors. I drank myself into numbness on more nights than I can count. But no matter where I went, the dreams followed, and in those dreams the Wechuge was never chasing me. It was simply there, waiting at the edge of whatever memory I was trying to escape. Sometimes it wore the faces of the men who died in that cave, sometimes it wore my mother's eyes, and sometimes it had no face at all, only a hollow shape that felt like hunger given form. And I woke from those dreams knowing that it was not punishing me, it was studying me. I began to notice small things, things that no one else seemed to see, like footprints in fresh snow that did not belong to any animal, or the way shadows in narrow alleys sometimes bent in ways that made no sense. And each time I felt the same pressure in my chest that I had felt on the mountain, as though the Wechuge was reminding me that distance does not mean separation. Years later, when I finally dared to go back to those peaks with a survey crew, I found something that confirmed what I had always feared, because high on a ridge near the old cave, carved into the stone where no natural mark should have been, was a spiral made of the same scratches we had seen in the snow beside the prospector's body. It was fresh. That was when I understood that the creature had not been bound to that place, and that the mountain was not its prison, but its home, and like any hunter, it could leave home whenever it wished. I am telling you this now because the men who control the records are gone, and the world has changed enough that secrets do not stay buried as easily as they once did, but also because I can feel it again. That familiar weight in the air that tells me I am not alone, even when no one is in the room. The Wechuge does not kill everyone it meets. Sometimes it lets one live. Sometimes it needs a witness. If you have made it this far, then you are already part of this story, because you now carry the memory of something that does not want to be forgotten. And that is why you need to subscribe to this channel right now, because every story we tell is another light in a dark place that was never meant to be illuminated. Leave a comment with the word witness if you felt something while listening to this, because acknowledging a thing is the first step in refusing to let it own you. And if you want to hear what creature we uncover next, whether it is a dogman in the forests of Canada, a wendigo in the frozen north, or something far older that hides in the deserts and ruins, then stay with us, because there are more stories waiting, and some of them are already watching you back, because some monsters hunt bodies, and some hunt attention, and now that you have given this one yours, it knows you exist,